We left off with the fall of the two kingdoms. In 721, the Assyrians invaded the northern kingdom of Israel and exiled most of the 10 northern tribes, with the exception of those who fled into Judah and increased the population of Judah by at least tenfold, probably more, turned the city of Jerusalem into a bona fide city, and brought all kinds of skills and abilities that enabled Judah to become a more prosperous kingdom. And then, as you might remember, through a number of missteps and military alliances, with the exception of that brief renaissance under King Josiah, who is remembered as the greatest king outside of David and Solomon, King Josiah introduced religious reforms. He banished all of the pagan priests and high places and all of those kinds of influences, and he was remembered as a wonderful king. There was a brief renaissance under Josiah. He even reconquered some of the territory of the northern kingdom, but he made the unfortunate decision of siding with the wrong side in a civil war to the north. And the Egyptians sided with the winning side, which was the Babylonians. So when the Egyptians wanted to come through Judea on their way to help fight against the Assyrians on behalf of the Babylonians, King Josiah sent an army to meet the Egyptians at a place called Megiddo. And there, King Josiah lost his life when one of the soldiers in the Egyptian side let loose an arrow, and it found its way into Josiah's upper body, and that wound eventually killed him. After that, there was a series of unfortunate and incompetent kings of Judah, and eventually Judah falls to the Babylonians in 587. They are exiled to Babylon, and there they live for 50 years. Okay, now, their time in Babylon, though, wasn't all bad. Okay, so what happened when they got there, the Babylonians actually allowed the Jews to live semi-independently. They lived in their own community. Many of them made a very good living in Babylon. In fact, when they were allowed to return, some of them refused because they preferred to stay. But the most important thing that happened in Babylon was that now that they had lost their king, their land, and their temple, all they had left was their writings and their Torah. So the Hebrew Bible at this point began to be edited and collected. And it was collected into the following 4 sections. First, there's the Torah, which are called also the books of Moses. That's the first 5 books: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, the books of the law. Then there was the historical books, beginning with Joshua, all the way through till the Chronicles. Now, the books of the Chronicles are basically a smaller, shorter version of the same story that's in 1st and 2nd Kings. So you've got Joshua, Judges, First and Second Samuel, First and Second Kings, and the books of the Chronicles. Those are the historical books. Then you've got the major and minor prophets. The major prophets being Ezekiel, Isaiah, Jeremiah. Sometimes this includes Daniel. We're going to talk about Daniel a little bit today because that came along much later. And then the minor prophets, the shorter books. And then a section of writings that we haven't talked about yet, and they're simply called the writings or the wisdom literature. Wisdom literature includes books like the Proverbs, the Psalms, Ecclesiastes, Job, as well as Ezra and Nehemiah. Now, Ezra and Nehemiah are more historical books than they are wisdom literature, but somehow that's how they got categorized. And I'm going to start out now by telling you the story of Ezra and Nehemiah, because they were the two leaders of the Jews when they returned back to Judah. How did they get back to Judah? Well, what happened is that the Persian Empire, which is modern day Iran, the Persian Empire under a man named Cyrus II, he had ambitions just like the other empires at that time to build a huge empire from the Tigris River down to the Nile. That was considered, to be the bee's knees. If you could go from the Tigris and Euphrates River Valley, which is the Fertile Crescent, all the way down to the Nile River, you had, the most important real estate at that time in the world. So Cyrus went to war with the Babylonians, and he defeated them in around 539 BC, something like that. And shortly thereafter, King Cyrus II, who is honored to this day by the Jews, issued an edict of religious freedom. And he told the Jews that they can go back to Judah, should they so desire, and that he would in fact help fund the rebuilding of the temple. So, one of the prophets, there were two important prophets that lived at that time. One was the second prophet named Isaiah, called Second Isaiah. All three Isaiahs are included in the book of Isaiah, but it's three different people. How do we know that? Because when you book of Isaiah, you can tell which era of history the passages are coming from. And there are three different eras of history, so we know there were three different prophets. Okay, Isaiah encouraged the exiles to return. That famous passage about every valley shall be lifted up and every mountain laid low, and a way will be made through the desert by the Lord. This was Isaiah telling the exiles to return, that God would see to it that they made it all the way back to Judah. Also during this time was the prophet Ezekiel. Ezekiel came along just before Judah was destroyed. And Ezekiel went into exile with the rest of them. So he lived in Babylon for a period of time, and he was important because he too predicted that God would see to it that his people were allowed to return back to their homeland. Now, one of the most famous of Ezekiel's prophecies is the Valley of the Dry Bones. You might remember that. Ezekiel has a vision. There's all kinds of dry bones in the valley. And God is talking to Ezekiel, and God says, "What do you see, Ezekiel?" He says, "I see a valley of dry bones." He says, "Tell the bones to come together." So the bones, they all come together. Now tell them to grow sinews, now muscles, now flesh. Pretty soon, all the bones are people. And they're alive and well and healthy. And, well, what Ezekiel is saying in symbolic language is that the people of Judah will be resurrected once again. They will return to their homeland. God is faithful. He will not abandon his people. Okay, so once they return, the problem is that what they find is nothing but ruins. All right, the Babylonians destroyed everything. So once they get back, there's a period of time when the people are really rather depressed. They don't know exactly how to handle the situation. You know, how are we going to rebuild this? How are we going to become a people again? But, you know, maybe this is not going to work. Well, along comes Ezra and Nehemiah. Okay. Each of them performed two very important functions. I'm going to talk about Nehemiah first because I can do that quickly. Nehemiah was in charge of rebuilding Jerusalem. So he organized, and he had a hard time getting people to do this because most of the Jews were busy trying to rebuild their lives. They went back to their farms, and they needed to work on their crops, and they need to take care of their families. They had other things to do. But Nehemiah wanted them to help work on the rebuilding of Jerusalem. So he recruited enough people that he was able to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem, actually expanded the city, I believe, and he rebuilt the temple. Now, when he was done rebuilding the temple, again, the people were kind of sort of ho-hum about it. You know, they remembered Solomon's temple, which was a very impressive structure. And this rebuilt temple was kind of a humble piece of work, and it didn't really impress anybody. But in any case, it still was able to function as a center of worship for the Jewish people, where sacrifices would take place. A high priest was in charge, and the priesthood was reestablished, and life was beginning to get back to normal. However, okay, here's what the main problem was, and this is what Ezra was tasked with addressing. Now, to get an idea of what Ezra was up against, think about the Samaritans to the north. All right, now the Samaritans were a people who were created by first, when the Assyrians destroyed the northern kingdom, they left some of the poorest Jews behind. Okay, and then they resettled people from other areas in what was the northern kingdom. And it was mostly south of Galilee, north of Judah. That area is called Samaria. It is now the West Bank, where the Palestinians live. All right. Out of the mixture of that group of people, Jews and people who were resettled there, came a group of people known as the Samaritans, named after what was the capital city, Samaria. Now, the Samaritans were mixed race, okay, and number one. Number two, while they accepted the first 5 books of the Bible, the Torah, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, as Holy Scripture, they did not accept the prophets or the writings. And number two, they worshiped at a place called Mount Gerizim. They did not worship in Jerusalem. Their holy site was this mountain that had been a place of worship during the time of the Northern Kingdom. Okay, so as a result of the exile of the 10 northern tribes, what came out of that eventually was the people called Samaritans. And there are Samaritan villages in Israel to this day. You can visit Samaritan villages there. There's not very many of them, but they're still there. Okay, that is what the Jews wanted to avoid. They did not want to suffer the same fate as the people of the north did, who wound up neither Jews or non-Jews. They were mixed race. So Ezra was in charge of seeing to it that the Jewish people reclaimed their identity as Jews, and it was his job to make sure that there were no influences from other ethnic groups. So this is what he did. Okay, he passed a number of laws, and he made sure that the people were taught the laws of Moses. Okay, so they knew how to live. They knew what to eat and what not to eat. They knew what to wear and what not to wear. And they knew where to worship. They knew all the laws that regulated Jewish life. Okay, Ezra would publicly read from the Torah so that people who were illiterate, anyone could learn what it meant to be a Jew. But the other thing he did, which was controversial at the time, but people obeyed his orders, is that he told every Jew that married a non-Jew to immediately get a divorce and find a Jewish wife, because he did not want mixed races into the land of Judah. He wanted to purify the Jewish people so that they were bona fide Jews, descendants of the people who had been exiled, and not mixed in with people from other ethnic backgrounds. So many of these people, they loved their wives and they had children with them, and it was kind of a sad state of affairs. But they did it. They did it anyway. And it's kind of a mystery. People don't really know what happened to all those women who were divorced because they weren't welcome in Judah. Where were they going to go? What was going to happen to them? Nobody really knows what happened to them. But in any case, that was Ezra's policy, and that's what he did. So at this point now, we are in the, let's see, they returned around 5:30. We are approaching the, that would be the 6th century. We are well into the 5th century at this point, and Judah is now a province. They call them satraps, a province of the Persian Empire. And by and large, they lived in peace under the Persians. There were no rebellions like there was under the Romans. There was no real trouble. Things actually turned out pretty well for them under the Persians, which is another reason why the Jews honor King Cyrus to this day. They consider, they even minted a coin with Cyrus's picture on it at one point. So that's an important thing to remember in terms of their overall history. This was a relatively, shall we say, peaceful and productive time in terms of reestablishing their identity as a separate people, set apart. You know, they believed themselves to be God's chosen people, and they were going to make sure that they lived accordingly. Okay, the other thing that's important during this time is that much of this literature that I called wisdom literature was produced. And I want to talk briefly about some of these books. Okay. So the Psalms were collected. These were poems that were used in worship for a number of different occasions. Some of them were composed long before the exile. Some were composed at the time a king was anointed and ascended to the throne. Some were composed as songs of ascent. The people during a pilgrimage festival would travel up the mountain to Jerusalem singing these psalms as they went along. They called them psalms of ascent. Some of them were psalms of lament, where an individual was suffering for some reason and was crying out to God for help. There are psalms for many different occasions. These were gathered and put together into a book, a kind of worship book. The book of Job. Okay, now the book of Job was composed largely because there was a belief about suffering among the Jews, that suffering was the result of punishment from God. In other words, if someone contracted leprosy, or if someone, you know, experienced a disaster of some kind, or if someone was born blind, or something terrible happened, the thinking was that somebody sinned. Okay, somebody must have sinned. It's like the disciples asked Jesus when they encountered the blind man. Their first question was, who sinned that this man was born blind? Was it his parents or was it him? The assumption was that, you know, suffering was a punishment from God for sin. The book of Job was composed because for many people, they began to see that this theory just didn't square with reality. Because not only during the exile, but later on in their history, there were periods of time when Jews who remained faithful in observing the law would be persecuted for that. Whereas Jews who became collaborators with a foreign enemy would, as a result, be rewarded. And some of them reach positions of power and authority. And so the idea that only sinners suffered and the righteous were rewarded just didn't work. It just didn't square with reality. The book of Job explores that very issue. And it does so by having the main character, Job, suffer all these disasters. You know, his family is wiped out, his animals are wiped out, his wealth is wiped out, and then his health it turns bad. And his friends come to him and they try to convince Job that, Job, you must have done something wrong. There's got to be something in your past because God is just. Okay? Now that really was the issue. The issue was, is God just or not? Does God deal with people fairly? Do people get what they deserve? If people don't get what they deserve, the righteous a reward, the wicked a punishment, then you can't believe that God is a just God. Okay, so that was really the issue. Their need to believe that God was just. So these three friends, that's really what their motivation is in arguing that Job must have done something wrong. Okay, well, at the end of the book, there's no answer given to why Job suffered. However, God does finally answer Job. And basically what God says is, to put it in a nutshell, is that there are things that happen in human history and in our individual lives that we will never understand because we do not have the wisdom and insight that is necessary to understand the ways that God governs human history and human life. So basically the book of Job ends by suggesting that, number one, this idea of suffering is a retribution for sin. That's false. Okay, that is a false idea. And number two, the answer to suffering, is there an answer to suffering? And the book affirms that there is, but it's not something that we have the insight or the wisdom to understand. The Jews, if you were to ask, for example, a person who was very familiar with the stories in the Bible, to give an illustration of what that means, that suffering is something that we can't understand, what they might do is tell the story of Joseph. Okay, the story of Joseph is, as you might remember, Joseph is sold into slavery, then he's accused falsely of rape, then he's thrown into prison. Okay, he suffers all of these different things. But in the end, it was all done so that, and Joseph realizes this at the end of his life, so that he would eventually be in a position of power in Egypt and he could actually save lives. Now, no one could have seen that in advance, right? No one would have predicted that Joseph would end up being the second most powerful person in Egypt as a result of being sold into slavery. But that's what happened, okay? So Scripture's answer to suffering basically is God is sovereign, God is in control, and ultimately, in the end, God is just as well. And while we may not understand the meaning of specific events in history, there will come a time when there will be a resolution of some kind, and we will see that all along the wisdom of God prevailed. Now, there was another book that was written designed to answer the same question, at least partially. And that was the book of Daniel, okay? The book of Daniel is set during the time of the exile, okay? The Babylonian exile. But it was actually written after that. And the book of Daniel, there was a period in Jewish history that comes after the Persian period. We're still in the Persian period. But there was a time in Jewish history after the Persian period that we're going to get to shortly, when there was a rise of a specific kind of literature that began to be written. And that was apocalyptic literature. Now, apocalyptic literature is literature about the end times and about how there is among human life there's a battle between the forces of God and the forces of evil, and in the end God's going to prevail. Okay, so the book of Daniel, portions of the book of Daniel are apocalyptic. And the way the book of Daniel answers the question of suffering is in this way. If you read chapter 7 of the book of Daniel, chapter 7 consists of, is about a figure who is called the Son of Man. And Daniel has a vision. The Son of Man simply means a person who looks like a human being. And by the way, I think I mentioned this, but Jesus refers to himself as the Son of Man again and again and again. But in any case, that's what it means. Someone who looks like a human person, but their origin is heaven. Okay, in this vision of Daniel, the Son of Man is coming down on the clouds of heaven. And the reason that the Son of Man is coming down out of the clouds of heaven is because God is going to right all of the wrongs that have happened in human history. In other words, the way God's justice is ultimately demonstrated is that there is a resurrection from the dead. Okay, at this point, the Jewish people begin to believe in a resurrection. Prior to this point, there wasn't much said about life after death. There was this notion of Sheol, which was like a place of shadows. The Jews couldn't imagine that a human life could be complete without a body. Okay, they didn't believe in this idea of an independently existing ghost-like soul separate from a body. That was a Greek idea. They believed that human beings were enfleshed uh, and without a body, you didn't have a full human life. Uh, which is why the Apostle Paul, in his first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 15, when he talks about the end of time and the resurrection from the dead, what Paul says is that the perishable body dies and we receive an imperishable body, an immortal body, a body that is no longer vulnerable to suffering and death. Okay, so in this vision of Daniel, there is a general resurrection from the dead, and the Son of Man judges all people. The wicked are punished, and the righteous are rewarded. Okay, so that's the way God's justice ultimately prevails. So while on this earth, during human history, in time, while there are periods of time where evil people thrive and these evil people oftentimes oppress and make it very difficult for other people, deprive them of their rights, deprive them of their property, sometimes deprive them of their lives. While these things happen in human history, ultimately, in the end, God's justice will prevail because there will be a resurrection at the end of time, and at that point, the justice of God will be meted out accordingly. Okay, so some of the other wisdom books that were written during this period between the two testaments include also the Song of Songs. That's really a Jewish love poem. The reason that got into the canon is because people thought it was Solomon who composed it, and that what he was really talking about was not the love between a man and a woman, but the relationship between human beings and God. You know, the rabbis tend to interpret the Song of Solomon as a highly symbolic book, not as a love poem, which is what it appears to be when you read it. Also, the book of Proverbs was compiled and edited at this time. Those are wisdom precepts, precepts to live by. You know, and there's all kinds of different subjects that are addressed in the book of Proverbs. And then finally, there's the book of Ecclesiastes. Also, that one made it into the canon because, again, people thought it was Solomon who wrote it. The book of Ecclesiastes can sound sort of depressing, because what it says basically is that all life is vanity. And what he means by that is simply that all human beings pursue their own self-interest. And that's basically the way we all live. We all pursue our own self-interest. And but then he points out, okay, he says that he himself, in pursuing self-interest, in pursuing happiness and the pleasures of life, he tried riches and that didn't make him happy. He tried power, and that didn't make him happy. He tried wisdom, and that made him even more depressed, because he saw into the inner workings of the human heart, and that didn't please him at all. That made him even more depressed. So in the end, while it sounds kind of depressing, really, in the end, what the book of Ecclesiastes, what the theme is really quite simple. He says that the end of human beings, the purpose of life, is this: do your work to the best of your ability. Earn your living as a farmer, as a whatever, back then there were very few different, as a farmer, as an artisan, whatever. Do your work to the best of your ability. Support your family. Love your spouse. Love your children. And enjoy all the blessings that God has provided with. The food you have, the shelter you have, and most of all, your friends, your family, your community. That is the purpose of life, to enjoy the blessings that God has given us. Now, the book of Ecclesiastes doesn't purport to be a heavily in theological work. It's more about life in this world. But there's a certain amount of wisdom to what he's saying there, I think. And so you might try, if you haven't ever done it, just sitting down and reading through it. It's not all that long. It's kind of a fun book to read, actually. And in the end, the message, I think, is positive rather than negative. Okay. Let's see, what time are we getting to here? Okay. So the Persian Empire lasts all the way until the 4th century BC. Now, in the 4th century BC, there is a flowering in Greece, a renaissance that nobody has been able to explain. All right. The ancient Greeks had a flowering in philosophy, in sculpture and art, in medicine, in science, in dramatic literature, you name it, the Greeks were doing it. It was an absolutely amazing time in history for Greek culture. And Greek culture also produced several institutions that are with us to this day. For example, every Greek city had a theater, okay, where there would be dramatic presentations. Now, the Romans would later, change that from more than just drama to gladiatorial fights and all kinds of other unfortunate forms of entertainment. But for the Greeks, it was mostly drama. Okay, some of the great Greek dramatists were Euripides and Sophocles. Some of these dramas are performed to this day. Okay, and the other institution that the Greeks developed that was a part of Greek culture that's with us to this day are gymnasiums. Okay, gymnasiums were places of athletic competition. So the Greeks were big on athletic competition. But, okay, and this is where they came into conflict with the Jews, because later on, when Greek culture begins to have an influence on Judah and the building of cities in Judah, this becomes a big conflict. When the Greeks competed in athletic events, they did so without wearing any clothes. They did so in the nude. That was just a practice of theirs. That's the way they did it. They figured they would perform better if they didn't have clothes on. So they performed in the nude. The Jews, to say the least, didn't appreciate that particular practice. Okay. The Jews did not believe in exposing parts of your body in public. That was just absolutely verboten. So, so when some of these institutions began to have an influence in Judah, there was conflict over that. Okay. During this flowering of Greek culture, a man named Alexander was born in Macedon, just north of Greece. His father was the king of Macedon, so he was heir to the throne. And Alexander was actually tutored by Aristotle himself, one of the greatest philosophers of all time. Aristotle is right up there with the very, very most influential people who ever lived in Western intellectual history. In fact, some people would say Aristotle was one of the inventors of science, because he would collect specimens of different species, and he would categorize different species in different ways. Later, his method of categorization was replaced, but he started, you know, that whole idea of categorizing different species of life on Earth. So Alexander was actually tutored by Aristotle, and when he ascended to the throne, this was around the year 334, something like that, Alexander decided that he was going to bless the rest of the world by Hellenizing all other cultures. What that means is that he wanted to turn everybody into a Greek, culturally speaking. The Greeks believed that their culture was superior to any other. In fact, they referred to any foreigner not as a foreigner, but as a barbarian. Okay, so if you weren't a Greek, you were a barbarian. All right, so Alexander, he forms an army of 40,000 soldiers, and the first thing he has to do is defeat the Persian Empire. The king at this time was a guy named Darius. And so he forms his army, and he moves east, and he meets Darius on the field of battle, and he defeats him. And then Alexander, after defeating the Persian Empire and taking possession of it, he turns south. He defeats the Syrians, the Egyptians, and of course, Little Judah. He takes possession of Little Judah as well. Okay, so now Alexander, and as he actually, he made it all the way to Egypt. I'm sorry, to India before he was turned back. But Alexander lived a rather short life. He, after finishing his exploits, he returned back to Egypt, to the city that was named after him, Alexandria, which is right on the Mediterranean coast. And he was only about, I think, 32 or 33 when he died. Okay. So now you've got this huge Greek empire from Greece and Macedon all the way through the Persian Empire, which includes all the way from what is today the Middle East, all the way to Iran, Iraq, Syria, Palestine, Egypt, Turkey, Turkey, and then Greece and Macedon. That's a lot of territory, and it's all one empire. And after Alexander dies, there's a huge power vacuum and a struggle for who's going to take over. Well, what happens, to make a long story short, is that Alexander had three main generals: General Ptolemy, General Seleucus, and General Cominius. What they did is they got together and they divided up Alexander's empire. General Ptolemy took Egypt and areas north, which included Judah. Seleucus took all of the Persian part of the empire, which would have included Iran, modern-day Iran and Iraq, not Syria. Ptolemy had that, and Turkey. And Cominius took Greece and Macedon. Okay, so now you've got this empire, this Greek empire, and all three of these guys are imposing Greek culture on all the peoples that live in all of these regions. They're building Greek cities with all these Greek institutions. They've all got theaters, they've all got gymnasiums, they've got, they used to have a center that was a marketplace with columns along the street, and they were building all, and the goal was to Hellenize the whole civilized world. Okay, so now poor little Judah is under the rule of Ptolemy. So it's 2 o'clock now. I want to just end with this particular story that'll set the stage for us to follow the Romans next week. Okay, so one thing that Ptolemy does is he forcefully resettles a group of Jews to the city of Alexandria, Egypt. But the Jews who are living in Judah, some of them decide, hey, maybe we ought to go elsewhere too. You know, I mean, after all, this is a desert. There's not much opportunity here. It's hard to make a living. You know, it's hard to feed our families. This is not exactly the greatest place to live. So so many other Jews start moving. Okay, they move to Egypt. They moved to what was called the Ionian coast, which is the coast of Turkey. And this begins what is called the Jewish diaspora. That is to say, the Jewish people begin to leave Palestine, and there are colonies of Jews living in cities outside of Judah, outside of Palestine now. That begins to develop during this period. By the time we get to the New Testament, there's more Jews outside of Palestine than there are inside of Palestine. This is also the period when synagogues develop, because they have to have centers of worship and centers where the community meets. That's how synagogues developed. And then finally, this is the time when, now, since the Greeks had taken over, okay, what language is everybody speaking? Well, they're speaking Greek. All right. So by the time you get to the second generation of Jews who had left Palestine, they no longer know how to speak Aramaic. They're speaking Greek. So if you're going to make sure that these people know what it means to be a Jew, you're going to have to translate the Hebrew Bible out of Hebrew and into Greek. That is a fascinating story, and that's where we'll pick it up next time. Okay? Questions or comments before we end it for today?
It was very interesting, very interesting. Covered a lot of ground.
Covered a lot of ground today. I'm trying to move, the Persian period among the Jews is known mostly for the development of its literature. So that's why I talked about that, all of those wisdom books that were composed.
I'm going to have a read on Ecclesiastes.
I recommend it. Yeah, it's interesting to read it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, everyone. Well, I appreciate you joining me for these classes. Excuse me, I got a frog in my throat here. I appreciate you joining me for these classes. Next week, we are going to pick it up with the story of the translation of the Hebrew Bible into Greek, which is a fascinating story. And then we're going to talk about Greek rule, what happened during Greek rule, how the Jews rebelled against Greek rule, and the festival of Hanukkah came into being during that rebellion. And then a period of independence for the Jews under the Maccabees for about 100 years until the year 64 BC. And that is the year when the Roman general Pompey came to town, and at that point, the Romans took over. So we'll cover hopefully up until the time the Romans take over next week. Okay?
Thank you.
I have a question.
Okay, Mary, go ahead.
The Samaritans were mixed race people. What comprised their heritage?
So partly they were from the 10 northern tribes, so they were partly Hebrew, and the rest of them were people who were resettled from Assyria to the north, up in modern day Iraq. Some of those folks were, by the Assyrian Empire, were resettled into Samaria by the Assyrians. So when these resettlements took place, the population that was there intermixed with the resettled population, And out of that developed this new identity. And they called themselves Samaritans, after naming themselves after the former capital of the northern kingdom, which was Samaria. Now,
Got
the Jews, the Jews wouldn't have anything to do with the Samaritans. You might remember from the stories in the New Testament. And so we'll run into them. We'll run into them again when we get there. Okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Okay. Stay well, everybody.
You too.
Thank you.
Okay. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.